when clients show resistance, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when clients show resistance, the first thing we want to do is validate the reality-based constraints, right? You were kind of speaking to this. This is the flexibility. So we do not want to be in the habit of immediately jumping in and saying, you're being resistant, why don't you want to be there, right? Because that actually invalidates. So the first step is to validate reality-based constraints. And then the second step is in a tentative way to explore, okay, well, how can we, to be flexible, say, hey, can we validate the constraints? Can we solve it? Could we shift the appointment, right? Could you leave a couple minutes later? Whatever it might be. And then in a tentative way, in a gentle way, you would want to explore, hey, is it possible that something else might be happening here in addition? I know it's hard to get to our appointments when there's traffic, but it seems like maybe something else might be coming here too. I wonder if it's hard for you to engage in therapy. So we're validating what's really there, the possibilities, and then we are exploring. Again, it's kind of this two-step process we'll do over and over again in different ways, which is identify what's happening and then invite the client into exploration. Yes, excellent job. Here for chapter 3 in week 4. My hope today is to get probably about halfway through our lecture today, and then if we have a chance, I'm hoping to split up so that we can give you guys the opportunity to do role plays, and hopefully the next class will look similarly. Not next Tuesday, but the next Thursday, one of my friends and colleagues is going to come in, and I'm going to do a therapy session with her as well in front of you guys. Her name's Olga. Some of you guys might have her for personality. Some of you might not, but she's an excellent therapist. She's a great therapist, a great friend, and I'm really excited to continue. And what I will be focusing on with her is resistance, and how we address and explore resistance, which is a lot of what we did in our class presentation, right? It's exploring like, hey, what are validating? Hey, it makes sense that there might be some mixed feelings here. How can we validate and explore in a helpful way the mixed ambivalence and the kind of the side of ambivalence that's the parts of us that say, I don't want to be here. Really what we're trying to help our clients to do is to build a relationship with their defenses. We're not trying to eliminate the client's defenses. We're trying to build a relationship with the defenses so that the client can understand reasonably that it makes sense, right? Our clients make sense that they're feeling resistant or that defenses show up in ways that these defenses were once adaptive. They helped them in their original context. And then the third thing, this is a good thing to ask, this is a good thing to check in. Do we want to eliminate client defenses, or do we want clients to eliminate their defenses? Who said that?
Well, you have to kind of show them how like some defenses are appropriate for some times,
Yes.
and other defenses are appropriate for others. So.
Exactly. We want to help clients to see. We want them to learn how to discriminate. When are these old patterns of defending oneself helpful and adaptive? So when and with who are they helpful and adaptive? And when and with who is it appropriate to have new defense patterns, new relational styles? We are not trying to eliminate client defenses, and this is one of the reasons why in the therapy session we want to validate that the defenses are emerging with the therapist and explore it rather than try to give them, hey, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be nervous right now. This is a safe space. That's not true. It's not completely true. We want to help the client to learn to trust themselves. And individuals come to trust themselves when they build a relationship with themselves, when they come to know their own story and they can understand the utility and adaptive nature of their defenses. So here we are, chapter 3, honoring client resistance. And we say honoring because, again, we are helping the individual to build a relationship with themselves, with these different defenses. So when we look at our overview of the chapter and of defenses, our goal is to help you guys to learn to recognize when those resistances are showing up and to respond effectively. It's important to know that resistance is a normal and expected part of treatment. We need to be very considerate to not group clients into good clients and bad clients, into clients that deserve more therapy because they're easier to work with and clients that don't. Our goal is to help individuals to understand that your responses, your behaviors make sense. And so we have to adopt this same perspective. And here, something that I think is really important is that understanding, if I can spell that, we'll pretend that says understanding, equals compassion. Compassion is not something that you have to pretend. It's not something that you have to manufacture. Compassion is the natural result of understanding. There's the, yes?
Can you clarify the difference between compassion and empathy?
I would say that compassion is a more, they're very, very similar. And I don't, on the spot, I don't know if I could draw the line down between them. But I would say that maybe empathy might be something more like operationalized compassion. So empathy would be an expression of compassion, an expression of understanding. But the understanding itself is what's going to create compassion. So Plato says that everybody is fighting a hard battle that you know nothing about, so be kind. And this is kind of the central point of this idea. If you understand someone, if you understand their circumstances, naturally it'll be like, oh my gosh, of course you don't trust me. Your experience with every authority figure, every man in your life, has been that they've hurt you. Of course, as you're coming in here, you don't trust me and you think that this is dangerous, because if you were going to go off of all of your previous experiences with men, you shouldn't trust me. This is craziness, right? You're leading yourself into the same dark dungeon that you've experienced before. And so what we want to do is to say, hey, that makes sense. Let's validate that. But also, you and I, let's see if we can create something different for you here. And that actually gives the client, again, ownership over the therapeutic process and creates collaboration. So what is resistance? The easiest way to think about resistance is that it is a coping strategy that was once adaptive for the client. That's the short, simple, easy understanding of resistance. A coping strategy that was once adaptive for the client. The longer definition in the book definition is that resistance is the client's reluctance to enter treatment or explore a problem, which is usually based on fears that were once reality-based. And there's these fears that are of receiving the same unwanted response that they've experienced with others in the past when they ask for help, when they share their distress or their vulnerability, or when they risk trust and genuine involvement in a relationship. So based on the client's experience of these three things, asking for help, sharing distress, or risking trust and genuine involvement in the relationship, they've been hurt in the past. And this has created a defensiveness to avoid that same hurt pattern. That is what shows up in the therapy session, which we call resistance. One of the, what are we at, E? A really important aspect here, something that's very powerful to name, is ambivalence. And ambivalence is mixed emotions, mixed or contradictory emotional feelings about an experience. Most of our clients will have this. They'll have positive, which we call kind of approach behaviors. These are the behaviors that are really, really easy to engage with in therapy, right? Someone comes in and they say, I want to do better. I want my life to look different. I want to be healthy. I want better relationships. As a therapist, we're like, yes, great. Let's do that. I can help you. I can get on board with that. But most of the time, there's another side to that. And so a very easy way to just explore that is when we feel a very powerful message from the client, expect that there's a shadow of that message, right? If there's a big structure, right, and that structure is excitement, expect that on the other side of that is a shadow. I was talking to my wife recently because last couple weeks teaching this class, doing some other things that I've been doing some things at work, I just got to this point there where I was just feeling a real excitement. I felt like things were kind of starting to connect. I was kind of catching a flow. I felt like I'm in this place a couple years out of school where I'm finally getting the knack for therapy and settling a little bit more in, feeling a little bit more confident, but also in a natural way. I was feeling that for a week or two. And then about a week later, I don't know exactly what it was. I think it was a lot of different things, but I started kind of just feeling this shame, like a sense of anxiety, a sense of unsteadiness, a sense of insecurity. And at first I was a little bit troubled by this. I was like, where'd it go? Where did those good feelings go? But what I realized is okay, there's this big structure, which is excitement, but on the other side of that is all the times that I've been excited about something and been let down. All the times that I've been really engaged with something and tried to start something, and I have ADHD, right? I start a lot of things very exuberantly, and there's a saying that open-minded and creative people are great at creating companies, and they're terrible at running them, right? So you need creative, open-minded people to create the companies, and you need conservative, straight-minded, type A people to run them. I recognize that on the other side of that shadow was shame of all those times, and I'd been really connected with the excitement. And in connected with the excitement, there wasn't as much connection with the fears of doubt. And so what we can do is we can just normalize that. When a client says that they're really excited about something, and we don't have to shut that down. We honor and validate that excitement, but then we can ask, I hear you so excited about this thing, or I hear you really passionate about getting started with therapy and this healing process. I wonder if there's any feelings on the other side of that. I wonder if there's any parts of you that might not feel that way. And here we're helping clients to have a realistic understanding of what it means to be human. We have mixed emotions about just about everything. Our goal is not to just, oftentimes, motivational speakers or kind of coaches or things like that, the goal is, okay, connect with those feelings of passion and excitement. Just connect with those more. Those are your fuel. And this can really create kind of a toxic positivity and a burnout where we're so connected to this ambition, but then eventually we get thrown in the shadow side. And I don't know why I'm in these up and downs. Well, it's because we're human. And so what we can do is validate both sides. The more we can stay connected to both sides, the more we can listen to what each of these emotions are saying, and then our actions can actually be based on reality and based on a connection to ourselves, which means that we'll have a much better likelihood of carrying through the difficult times, knowing that it's normal and expectable. And so when we experience resistance and ambivalence, A, B, C, D, E, F, what's our goal? Our goal is to honor this outdated strategy. We want to help clients to acknowledge the developmental value, so to honor it. And then we want to help them see, is it functional? Is it helping here? Paul, you did a good job of talking to this. And so as this is happening, as we notice the ambivalence that comes up, as we notice the resistance, with each client, we want to be developing a conceptualization. And so we're looking at A, B, C, D, E, F, G, specific concerns. What are the family rules? What are fears of dependence? What might be fears of control? What might be beliefs of unworthiness? A lot of our clients will show up, and these will be really vital bits, either one or many will be vital bits of that resistance, of that ambivalence. What are the family rules you might be breaking in coming here? What has your experience been like of being dependent? Oh, well, when I'm dependent, I get controlled. I lose my sense of self. What are your fears of being in control? What are your fears of being controlled by others? What are your beliefs about unworthiness? And so what we're looking for is what is the underlying meaning, the underlying experiences, the developmental import of the different structures that we have in our mind for what coming into therapy is actually like. Finally, at the base of shame, or at the base of resistance, is shame. And shame fuels resistance. Make sure I spell fuels right. Get my U's and my E's mixed up here. Shame fuels resistance. When we ask for help, when we have emotional problems that we can't solve, oftentimes we feel a sense of insufficiency, a feeling or a sense that I'm bad, or I'm problematic, or there's something inherently wrong with me, an identity that's based in inadequacy. That's what shame is. And so our resistance and our defenses are driven by shame, driven at escaping shame. And so I want you guys all to think, as we're talking about this, of a time that you had to ask for help. Maybe it's sending a professor an email. Maybe it's asking a question after class. Maybe it's an experience in this class of having a question interiorly where you're like, oh, I don't get that, or I'm wondering about something. How does shame show up there for you? Is it easy for you to raise your hand and say, hey, could you clarify that? I didn't really understand what you were saying. Or when you have a question about something, do you think, I probably just didn't understand it right? It's probably my fault. Again, it's much more likely here that because I'm a teacher, right? My role is to educate you guys. My role is to describe things well. Of course, I can't do that perfectly, but because of that, it's much more likely that if you don't understand something, it's because I did an inadequate job of explaining it, rather than because there's something inherently wrong with you that leads you to not being able to understand things. So understanding that shame underlies all these different patterns of resistance can help us to have a softer approach when we're exploring that resistance. When we look at resistance, when we look at the individual, one of the keys to contextualizing their behavior is attachment. As we talked about in chapter 1, when we talk about attachment psychologically, what we're talking about is the bonds with the caregiver, what somebody could expect, what they could not expect in terms of whether their needs would be met, whether their needs would be seen, and how effective will their caregivers be in identifying and meeting those needs. So conceptualize attachment. That would be number 2. Yeah. Looks like my things are messed up for today. So we have secure attachment. And the secure attachment consists of a safe haven and a secure base. Who can tell me what a safe haven is?
A person the client can rely on to have like a shoulder to cry on.
Yes, that's a great way to put it, yeah. A secure haven is a place to bring distress. A safe haven is a child's experience that when they are hurting emotionally, there will be a place for them to be held and to be soothed. Who can tell me what a secure base is? Yes.
Someone that they can like come to find support and like become independent and venture out while still knowing that like they're there, but like they can't.
Yes, exactly. And what's key with the secure base is that the support that the child is getting is support for independence, support for a healthy independence. So a secure base, didn't finish that one, did I? A secure base is a place from which to go out. A safe haven is a place of which to go. And what secure attachment is that securely attached children are secure in their expectation that when they're distressed, their caregiver will hear it and respond, and that they'll be able to help them meaningfully help them. what we're doing, we talked about this two kind of step process that we're essentially constantly doing in the therapy session. Can anybody tell me what that process is? Yeah. Identify and explore, right? So where would identify happen here? When we're looking at safe haven and secure base.
Those needs are being met.
Say that again?
If those needs are being met, like for safe haven, like if they're coming to mom and mom's brushing them off, those needs aren't being met.
So that's how we would look at it in their relationship with their caregiver. Now, if we look at ourselves as the caregiver, what does identifying it mean? It means that we are creating a safe haven, right? We're saying like, hey, we can bring this here. So when we identify, we're creating a safe haven. When we identify distress, right? Because security is about the caregiver accurately seeing the need. So when we name the need and we help the client to identify the need, we're creating a safe haven. And then when we want to explore with the client, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, now that this is a safe space that we can identify your need, we're going to go into the emotion and we're going to actually explore it further. We want to be cultivating a safe, secure, we want to be cultivating a secure attachment throughout. When we miss, right, when we're misattuned, these are the times when maybe we might get these screwed up, or we might think that a client needs one thing, right, we're not attuned, and then we give them something else. But over and over again, we're creating a safe space to hold, and then we ourselves are with the client exploring out into what might feel like dangerous waters. And so it's easy as a therapist. It's a little bit easier to create this safe haven, and it can be harder to create the safe space. These are easy to create with those approach behaviors. But with the ambivalence, with the resistance behaviors, we are typically accustomed and attuned to resist resistance. Here's the thing about resistance. When somebody's feeling resistant, when you're feeling resistant in your life and you notice that, what do you say to yourself? I need to be more open. What else? What are some other words we would say there? I need to stop being so resistant. I need to be more open. I need to be more vulnerable. Yeah. I need to be more accepting is commonly the thing we say, right? I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, I need to be more accepting of life, right? Here's the paradox. If you are in a place of resistance and you say, I need to stop doing that and be more this, what are you doing? Alex, you're being resistant, right? When you're saying, I'm being resistant, I just need to stop this and I need to be more accepting. You are employing resistance to try to solve your issue of resistance. And when you add resistance to resistance, what do you get? You get more resistance. This is how we fall into traps with our clients. Right? Oh, I keep having these negative thoughts about myself. I have this critical voice. Oh yeah, let's change that thinking pattern. This person's saying, I have this thinking pattern that isn't helping me. Yeah, let's push that out of the way. Because that's all we're doing is we're adding more resistance to resistance. So what's the solution? If adding resistance to resistance, even if it's in the name of acceptance, isn't accepting, what do we need to do?
Explore it.
Yeah, explore it, which means that we need to allow it. We need to allow it to be the case. So when we're feeling resistant, what acceptance actually looks like in that moment is exactly what you said, Mina. It's saying, okay, I'm feeling pretty resistant. What's happening for me right now? How is that resistance showing up? When we do that, when we allow the resistance, allowing the resistance, and that doesn't mean that we are feeding the fire, but when we allow it to be the case, because when we allow things to be the way that they are already that way. So all we're doing is conforming ourselves to reality, conforming ourselves to the vision that this is already happening here. When we allow ourselves to see with curiosity what's actually happening here, that is acceptance. And typically when we approach resistance with a legitimate acceptance of allowance and exploration, the resistance diminishes. So a key in therapy is that when we pay attention to positive emotions, they grow and they expand. And when we pay attention to negative emotions and negative experiences, they shrink and they fade away. And this is a paradox because we have this hard-wired, ingrained mentality of the pleasure principle, right? Pursue what feels good, push away what feels bad. But that just leaves us further exasperated. And so a key here as well is that when we pay attention to positive emotions and experiences, they grow. And when we pay attention to negative experiences, they shrink. I'm not talking about thinking about them, and I'm not talking about rumination, because rumination and thinking isn't actually paying attention, it's problem solving. When I'm talking about paying attention to the negative experiences, it means allowing them to be there and then exploring them with the belief that something good can come out of it. So when we look at addressing resistance, the key in this is that we want to address resistance rather than avoiding it. We want to do this in a non-threatening, non-blaming way. And when we do that, that actually increases the client's participation in therapy. So we are non-blaming. And our typical two-step process is to validate or affirm, and then inquire and explore. If a client continually comes late to sessions, if a client misses a session completely, it's very easy and very safe for us to get up into our high horse in our therapy chair and say, you're just being resistant. There's no way you could have gotten stuck in traffic every single time you're coming here. If this client has a real difficulty attending things on time, what type of response do you think they typically elicit from other people? You're always late. And why might someone say that they're always late?
They're being resistant to that person.
You're being resistant, but what might mom, dad, teacher, brother, sibling, friend say?
You're irresponsible.
You're irresponsible, exactly. Right? So I'm going to define the whole of your humanity as irresponsible. Right? This creates this shame-based sense of self. So if a client comes late to a couple sessions in a row and immediately we jump into, well, it seems like you're being resistant here. We are just doing the same interpersonal pattern. We are labeling them, we're blaming them, and we're increasing their shame. And the more we increase their shame in therapy, the more we practice these same problematic interpersonal processes, the more likely they are to drop out. Because nobody likes that. Frankly, it's not helpful. And so we're affirming the reality-based constraints. We're trying to step in and be flexible and problem solve first. And we have to do this in a meaningful way. We actually have to believe that there are reality constraints and explore them. And then we say, okay, you've been late a couple times, and last session we talked about some problem solving of how we might be able to approach therapy later. I wonder if it could be that there's maybe some parts of you that have a hard time with you showing up in therapy. Or maybe when you're running late, you feel overwhelmed that maybe the same thing might happen here that's happened in so many other places. So we're inquiring and exploring with the client if there could be some complex emotions here, if there could be some ambivalence. As therapists, as individuals, we are typically pretty resistant to exploring resistance, right? We want to avoid exploring these things at all costs for a multitude of reasons. What are we on? Are we on 4? That's IV, yeah. So therapist reluctance. We want to face resistance head on, without fear, without drama, without complexity. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
As a therapist, let's say your client is being resistant, doesn't show up to sessions anymore, or they suddenly drop out without an explanation. How do you react? Do you call them, ask them why, convince them to come back, or like what do you do?
If we address resistance early on and effectively, the chances of that happening will be far less. And if we address resistance effectively early on and they still drop out, we'll be able to know conceptually why that happened. We do not want to be complicit in the client's defenses. So if a client, this will happen to you pretty frequently, client will say, you know, my life is so busy, frankly, I just don't have the time for therapy right now. If we're complicit in those defenses, right, if we care more about the client liking us than anything else, well, like, oh yeah, you know, you have so much going on. Let's go to every 2 weeks, right? But the first thing is we want to validate the reality-based constraints. Be like, wow, it really is difficult to make time to come to therapy in such a busy work week. But then we want to explore. Could this kind of be the center of the problems that are bringing you into therapy in the first place? That it's really hard for you to emphasize your own growth when you have so many obligations on your plate. And I might say something, on the one hand, I would really love to accommodate what will help you best, but I wonder if first we can map on what's happening here and then see what's actually best for you. Because it could be that the best thing is to go every 2 weeks. But it could be that the best thing for you is actually to endure through this difficulty and the stress of making therapy appointments so that you can put your needs where they belong, so that you can fill up your cup, so that whatever those responsibilities are, they're in their proper place. And so when a client drops out, we want to check with our own conceptualization of the case, and we want to explore that question. Am I providing a resolution to their interpersonal patterns and interpersonal problems, or am I repeating them? Am I reenacting them? Yeah. So we want to know when clients, if we don't know what happened, that means that we missed some resistance, that we didn't do an adequate job. Because resistance is a part of every individual's experience in therapy, this is one of the reasons why we want to name it and explore it early on. Because then, if you don't explore it and name it early on, when they drop off, if you call up and you say, hey, I wonder if this is part of your resistance, that's going to feel like blame and criticism. But if you say, hey, you know, in that first session, you mentioned that it might be hard for you to make your own time because you don't know how to value yourself. You said that to me and it stuck out, and I'm wondering, could that be the same thing happening here? If so, how can we make this different? So your conceptualization will guide your intervention. And so there's 3 fears that are kind of the core of why we might not do that, why we might not explore in the beginning. The fear of being blaming. We're going to put this is going to be one here. The fear of blaming, that we're nervous that the only way to bring something up is in a blaming or critical manner. 2, let me just clarify that. We'll make this little guy A. We're afraid of rejection, or we're afraid of our own failure. So we don't want to bring up resistance because we're afraid that it might be an indication that we're not a good therapist. Or the third is that we are afraid of criticism. Who likes being told that they're doing something wrong? Why do none of you, except for maybe Josh, why do none of you like being told that you're doing something wrong?
It's like, for a personal note, like if somebody tells me I do something wrong, I can take it out of 2 ways. Either I'll look at it from like a third party standpoint, like I'll pull myself back from the situation and
Yes.
be like, okay, I can understand where you're getting this, I'll work on it.
Yeah.
But then there's also like a hyperfixation that it's like every time I do something, I'll like keep
Now why? What's underlying that? What does receiving a criticism possibly equal that would make it of the utmost importance for it to drive your thoughts and like figure it out?
It'd be like feelings of, because like for lack of a better term, dumb. Like
Yes.
you're like you can't really do much, so people view you as like, oh, since you're failing at this, or since like since you're doing it wrong, you're stupid.
You're stupid, right? Shame was said, right? All this can kind of go back to shame. If we believe that criticism of our behavior, yeah, Grace.
Oh, yeah, just kind of like feeling
Insufficient.
insufficient or not enough. You want to please other people, you want to be helpful, contribute, and so when you're criticized, you're like, oh, I'm not contributing, I'm not enough.
I'm not, right, and that's the trick. I'm not contributing equals I'm not enough. Yeah, John Paul.
The book was saying that like the difference of guilt and shame is that guilt is when you feel that you did something wrong or you did something bad, or shame is like when you feel that I am bad or
Yes.
I am wrong or there's something wrong with me, and that like it's like you have a, it says you have a total all-encompassing feeling about yourself.
Exactly. Exactly, and that's this situation, right? That my behavior, no, that didn't spell that right, equals my being. Right? You are not your behavior, but typically we're taught to evaluate ourselves rather than to value ourselves. We're taught to evaluate ourselves rather than to value ourselves, right? If you do all your class and you sit in the classroom and you don't misbehave when you're in grade school, you are a good student. You're a good boy. You're a good girl. And if you misbehave, you are bad. So this creates a belief that if I make a mistake, I am a mistake. And so us as therapists, as well as we share this with humanity, believe that if I make a mistake, I am a mistake. And so if a client has criticism, it means that they're seeing that I really am as bad as everybody thinks, or as I secretly think. And so when we,
Yeah, so in my philosophy class yesterday, something he said really like stuck out to me,
Yeah.
and it's sort of really relevant. And he said that we often see people as human doings instead of human
Yeah.
beings.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and this is called fusion, right? We fuse our belief about ourselves with our action. Or I have bad thoughts, therefore I'm a bad person. We have a misattribution of being and doing. And the truth is that we do have character. And our character is our habits. We can have a positive character, we can have a negative character, right? We can have a virtuous, a continent, an incontinent, or a vicious character. But we are good, no matter what our character is, because the key in as a human person is to hold on to two things at the same time. I am a good person, and that's my dignity and my value. And I can do things that are good, neutral, or bad. But it's important that we don't equate one to be the other. Because as soon as we do, we enter into a vicious cycle of self-judgment, and we never get off the hook. So we need to learn to hold both of those things at the same time. This is what Albert Ellis calls the unconditional self-acceptance. I am unconditionally good and worthy of being. Well, because I am. If I wasn't worthy of being, I wouldn't exist in reality. And at the same time, my actions have an effect on me, but not an effect on my dignity. And so what we can do is we can ruthlessly criticize and analyze our behavior, but never our personhood. And that's what we're trying to help clients to understand how to do, to look at their behavior, Caitlin, in the way that you said, right? I can analyze whether I did something that was helpful or unhelpful, but that's much different than saying, am I a good person or a bad person? And so we're afraid that if we welcome criticism from our clients, that will mean that we are bad people. It will prove the things that we are afraid. And we can also be afraid that if we address resistance, that it will put us in a superior position over the other person, that it'll make us better than somebody else. The reality is that we're just learning to talk about the here and now and the relationship that's happening in front of us. And so on the other side, we have the client's resistance. And these really parallel very much so. But the biggest thing is that Clients, they're just unaware a lot of times. Yeah.
Can you repeat what
Oh, yes. We're afraid that it puts us in a position of superiority. That it would create that we would not be able to bring up resistance without creating a power dynamic. Because oftentimes that's the experience that we have, that the only people that address resistance are people that are hoisting themselves above us. The client's resistance, to work with resistance, their fear, the reality is that a lot of times they're just not aware of it and they don't understand it. It's a point of frustration to them. And so this is where what we can do, which is remarkably healing, is help them to learn to honor their resistance simply as an outdated coping strategy that served their self-preservation, but may be now causing them issues in relationships. So there's a few process comments that Tiber discusses using in exploring resistance. And he says, one of the things we might say is, if you and I begin to work together, and this is on page 77, if you and I begin to work together on your problems, what could go wrong between us? What could I do that might hurt you or make things worse if you take the risk of letting me try to help you? How could our religions, our ethnicities, our gender differences get in the way and become a problem for me and you for our work together here in therapy? We're trying to facilitate the client to bring some realistic things that might get in the way of therapy and talk about them. And when we talk about them, we can manage and address them. Excellent. And so there's a 4-step process to working with resistant throughout the whole course of therapy. And that's to identify, validate, track, and generalize. So we're identifying, and this is simply to say that we're noticing when it shows up in therapy, putting a name to it. We're validating it. And remember, whenever we see resistance, as a therapist, what we're hearing is an outdated coping strategy that used to help. That's what we're identifying, and that's the language that we use. An outdated coping strategy that used to help. So we're contextualizing the utility of it. And this, in the beginning of therapy, we work more to help contextualize the validity of it. Later on in therapy, we'll be a little bit less explanatory. And then we are tracking it. So throughout the course of therapy, we're tracking the interpersonal process to see if that pattern of that outdated strategy is actually becoming normalized in our therapeutic relationship. And fourth, and most, well, maybe not most importantly, we are generalizing the experience. And this is the key, and this is the process pretty much of the interpersonal approach throughout the whole of therapy, is we're changing the pattern, but then once we're able to change that pattern in the relationship with the therapist, we are helping the client to generalize that new process with the therapist into other relationships that the client may have.
Can you explain validating and tracking again?
In validating, what we're doing is we're contextualizing the adaptive nature of the defense. So we're validating, like, we're not dismissing the resistance or labeling it or blaming it. We are normalizing and allowing that in this relationship, it's expectable that the old ways of taking care of you are going to show up here with me and you. And then when they show up, we're going to say, wow, yeah, how expectable, right? Clients come in, they have a great change, and then things backslide. We say, yeah, how expectable that for the first time in 25 years, you did something different, something that was adaptive and helpful. How expectable that this week you might go right back to the old ways and the old patterns. It's more expectable than not. It actually would be a real big surprise if this just became this upward trend that never stopped. progress, right, is that we've seen that, perhaps we've seen it, perhaps we haven't, that we think that growth looks like this, but really it's like a line that's all over the place. And then to track, this is where we are having a feel in the therapy session. How's this interpersonal process?
So this is referring to the core problem of the resistance?
This is referring to, yeah, what we're doing was we're noticing how our patterns fit into the conceptualization of the client. So in the therapy session, we want to kind of be checking, am I reenacting or am I helping this person to do something new?
So the whole tracking is like, that's like where we're seeing it play out in the relationship, and we're like adjusting our conceptualization.
Yes.
We're also trying to bring corrective emotional experiences within the relationship, and like that's all on the track. And then after that, we try to bring that into their world outside in generalization.
Yes. Yeah. This is a little bit more, in the beginning especially, this is a little bit more internal for the therapist. And as therapy continues, our tracking will become more explicit with the client and bringing the client in on that. And then generalizing is transferring that new process to other relationships. We're helping the client to discriminate. Are these old patterns helpful in this relationship, or are they not helpful? Which relationships are safe for me to be different in a more adaptive way? Which relationships might I have to withdraw, right? If somebody's chronically had somebody who was very aggressive to them throughout their whole life, it's unlikely that that person is going to change. So it actually would be maladaptive for that person when somebody's being very aggressive to say, you're hurting me so badly right now and I don't like it. Boom, you're shut down again. You're hurting me even doubly now because I just told you of my vulnerability and you're striking me down again. Boom. You've really hurt me and crushed me, so I feel like just a dust pile. That's not adaptive. What we would want somebody to realize is, oh, that relationship isn't a place that I can feel safe, so I shouldn't act like it. I should have some defenses up and I should remove myself from that situation. I should also realize that just because Jeffrey is like that to me, it's not necessarily an indication of me. It could be an indication of Jeffrey. Not everybody's Jeffrey, so I can experience different things in different relationships. So the reason that we want to really identify and explore this with every single client, what are we on, 6?
Yes.
6 or 7? Is that research finds that at the outcome of therapy, every single client, almost every single client has some negative experiences of the therapist to some degree. And this occurs in helpful therapy sessions, that there are some aspects of the interaction with the therapist that the client didn't like, some negative feelings about certain behaviors or certain issues. And they hide those from the therapist because it doesn't feel safe to bring them up, right? My therapist is so helpful. He does this thing that's kind of annoying, but he's so helpful. I wouldn't want to lose the helpfulness by noting that every time he talks about the experiences in his life that he's found helpful, that is not actually helpful for me. I wouldn't want to point that out. I wouldn't want to make him feel bad. I like the way this is set up, right? So this happens pretty much for every single successful therapy outcome, for the negative ones too, but for every successful therapy outcome. And so if that's happening for all of the successful outcomes, it's definitely happening for the outcomes where people terminate prematurely. And so this is where we are, as Paul said, we're providing that role inclusion. We're telling the client, we're providing an educative process in the first early sessions by saying, how did this go today? Was there anything that you didn't like about the session? If there was anything that you didn't like, would you be able to tell me about it? Would that be hard for us to talk about? You're normalizing that this is a relationship where we can talk straight and where we can discuss the issues that are emerging in the here and now. And so what we do, and this is kind of speaks to that tracking process that you were asking about, Jean-Paul, is we're formulating a working hypothesis. From our first interactions with the client, we're having a light hold on, what's happening here? How does it fit in the client's conceptualization? I think somebody asked earlier, a couple classes ago, like, are you kind of always working and reworking your conceptualization? Yes. From the first phone call, from the first email, you're just starting to notice the patterns. And so when you have a working hypothesis, it helps you to understand the working hypothesis is the answer to the question of how does this person make sense? So when we ask that question, how does this person make sense? And we come up for it with an idea of how they make sense. That creates our working hypothesis. And that working hypothesis, as we get to know somebody more, becomes a more concrete conceptualization. And in this working hypothesis, what we're speculating about is what are the different ways that coming into therapy might be aversive to the client? What are the different ways that the client might not want to enter into therapy? And again, with that interpersonal perspective, we're exploring how might this resistance or defensiveness be their attempt to manage anxiety with me? How might their resistance be an attempt for them to manage this interpersonal anxiety and make sure that this doesn't end up like the problematic relationships they've experienced in other places in their life? Remember, we talked about these interpersonal ways of mitigating anxiety in the relationship. Those anxieties, those behaviors constitute the relationship with the caregiver. This caregiver goes on even well after the caregiver may have passed away, or even well after the client might be out of their parents' house. Insofar as they're still acting out these problematic interpersonal patterns, it's because they're attached, whether consciously or unconsciously, to their caregiver. And so if we're asking them to do something different with us, what we're actually asking, it's very threatening because we're asking them to kind of break their attachment ties with their caregiver. And this is one of the reasons that we want to be very sensitive when we're exploring this. Something that I say frequently to clients is that I want to be sensitive, but not afraid. I want to be sensitive to the importance of the thing that you're bringing up, but I don't want to avoid it. And I want you to know that my sensitivity as we talk about this isn't a fear of going there, but it's my way of wanting to be respectful to how important this relationship is or how important this conflict is for you. And so we identify, we approach, and we appreciate when the client is able to enter into these conversations about resistance. We say, hey, I'm really glad we can do this. I'm really glad that we can have a relationship where we can talk straight. I like that. I like that when you tell me that I do something that's frustrating to you, because that tells me that you're really showing up as you. I like it when you express your thoughts, your opinions, your perspectives. And what I like most is when you and I are actually able to create something here that's unique, that is different. And when I know and you know that we're on the same page about how we can address and work with things. Jean-Paul, did you have a question here?
Yeah. I was saying, you were saying that like you're talking about you're asking them to break relational ties with the caregiver. Is that like you're saying that like the way they learn to relate in these different ways was with their caregiver, and now you're trying to like change those?
Yes.
And you're saying like that's just hard because
It's just hard.
it's
It's just hard for a lot of reasons, primarily because they're not. We don't realize that we've created this relationship with our caregivers, right? So I know there's a lot of people in here who are bilingual. I am not, right? So I speak English in an okay way, right? And as you can tell, the writing of it is even a little bit more of a less okay way. But how old? how old are you when you start learning English in school? When you start reading, you start learning how to use commas, you start learning punctuation, and you start learning grammar. How old are you about? Fourth grade, 6 or so. I don't know grades and ages.
Are you asking like in America or like?
Yeah, in the States.
Oh.
Like when do we start like formally learning language?
First grade.
Kindergarten, yeah. By that time that we go to school and we start studying language, the child has already pretty much completely internalized and understood the English language or whatever language they're learning. Like by the time we go to school and we start learning English or learning Spanish or learning Aramaic or learning French or learning whatever our native dialect is, we've already learned pretty much all of it. And so it's pretty bizarre that we go to school after we've learned the language and then we start learning it. Now, when does a child realize that they're learning English, learning Arabic, learning Spanish, when learning French? When does a child realize, come to an awareness that they're learning that language? Yeah, it's a good question, right? When do you realize that you are learning English, learning Arabic? What language did you speak growing up? Like what in your house? Aramaic. When did you realize, and you probably maybe a little bit earlier on because you know a lot of different languages, but when did you realize what I'm doing here is communicating in Aramaic?
When I started using it out of the house,
And about how old is that?
kindergarten.
Kindergarten, Father? Yeah.
For me, you can realize you can get a communication way, and you can get also culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's this different dimension of kind of how it's embedded in the way we talk and then how we talk like in our culture. Yeah. But by the time that happens, how much power has the child had over what they're learning? You're telling me that you grew up and you had all the power over whether you learned Aramaic or not.
Well, you mean before school or?
I'm saying in the process of learning language, no power, right? By the first time you come to recognize, oh, I'm learning a language, you've already learned it and you've had no power, no control. It's happened unconsciously. We begin learning language before we even know what a language is. And if this is true with the way we speak, how much more is it true with the way that we relate, right? And so we take it as we can't control, when you learn different languages, you might in a certain sense, but you can't really control what language you think in. Now you can learn to think in another language, but you can't stop that your natural thinking is in another dialect. And so if this is true in our language, how much more true is it in relationships? By the time that we realize that a relationship is a thing, and we can call it a relationship, we've already internalized all the rules for the relationship in the context in which we develop in it. And so I think it wouldn't make sense for me in 5th grade when I starting to realize, oh, I'm learning English, to go, I should be speaking in Spanish. Like, why am I speaking in English? This is a stupid way to speak. The grammar's all screwed up. Why is it goose and geese and not geeses? And, why is there two and two, right? And some of them have a W and some of them have an O, and I don't know. Why do I have to? I have no control over that. And this is how we work in relationships, and this is what our clients will come in and they'll say to us. Be like, why do I always do this? Why do I always put myself down when I have a success? Why do I always criticize other people just so automatically? Why do I hate myself? Why do I X, Y, Z, whatever it is? And that is just as logical as to say, why did I learn English when people were speaking the English to me when I was in my mother's womb? And so we really want to help clients to understand, well, you didn't really have control over the relationship patterns that you developed. And someone told this to me, a client, a little while ago. I'd never heard it, but they said, my trauma is not my fault, but my healing is my responsibility. My trauma is not my fault. My relationship patterns aren't my fault, but changing them is my responsibility. And this is that difference between my behavior equals my action, or my behavior equals my dignity, and being able to realize, like, okay, there's a certain amount of my behavior and the way I learn to behave that is outside of my control. But it is my responsibility to recognize that and change that. And so this is the climate. This is the compassionate understanding that we want to create. It's like, yeah, JP, of course you didn't learn Spanish. Like that, of course. But you want to learn it? Like, we could do something different now. We could learn, right? That's the kind of climate that we want to create towards relationships. And so we'll begin next class with talking about addressing resistance at the initial telephone contact. When we don't need to hammer resistance down our client's throat, but we want to create a culture of a relationship in which let's expect resistance and let's learn how to respond to it well. Cool, so we will pick up on Tuesday.